Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I am very honored and excited to have Viggo Mortensen on the show today. Um, Viggo, I mean, as you know, he was in Lord of the Rings, which is what gave him international attention, but I mean, he's been in several films, like The Green Book. Most recently, he was in a film that he actually wrote, directed, and starred in, called The Dead Don't Hurt, which I actually saw recently and found very compelling. Um, but Vigo also does poetry, he does art. He's the founder of Percival Press, which publishes not only his own work, but the work of other artists that are not as well known. So Vigo, thank you. I appreciate your time. I know you've been so busy, and I'm really glad that you're on the show today.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
So, Vigo, I wanted to ask you because I know Lord of the Rings is something that comes up a lot for you, but I did
Mm.
want to ask you, is there a particular role you're most proud of that you've done that you think when I did this, I think I did my best and I think it's what I'm most proud of?
Um, I mean, different roles demand different things from you. Sometimes it's a longer preparation, or you have to learn skills that you don't have. So those are a little more difficult. And if you manage to get through that somehow and give the director and your fellow actors a decent performance, to work with, then you feel good about it. But it's hard to pick one, even movies that didn't turn out as well as I hoped they would. I enjoyed the process. You always learn something, researching and interacting with other people. Every movie shoot is different. Every day on every movie shoot is different. Like any other person, you wake up feeling differently on some days, and some days it's harder, sometimes it's easier. Depends on the people you're working with. But it's kind of like asking someone to pick their favorite pet that they've ever had, or my favorite child or something, it's hard to say. I like all the characters that I played, whether the movies turned out great or not, whether I feel I was at my best or whether the movie was well edited. But I mean, obviously there's certain roles that were where I had some doubts about whether I was the right guy for it, and then it turned out to be a good experience, and I feel good about, like things like Green Book, or there's a movie that I don't know how many of your listeners have seen or viewers have seen. Far From Men, it's called in English. It's a movie in French and Arabic, and that was a lot of work. And I loved that story. It's a good story. But of the more well-known movies, like anybody who worked on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I mean, it was a long haul, and we all learned a lot, and we got to be very close. And that was a big challenge for everyone. And I'm proud of that. What we all did together. But Green Book I liked a lot. I enjoyed the experience of making Captain Fantastic. That's a good character as well. It has to do with who you interact with and how well that turns out. I mean, on that movie, for example, with all those kids and the way Matt Ross
Yeah,
directed
yeah,
all of us and prepared us, that was a great, great experience. Very positive in every respect. I mean, it was a really instructive. I hadn't directed a movie at that point, even though I'd wanted to for years. And what Matt Ross is something I really admire, the way he prepared that and the way he communicated with his crew, technical crew, and with the actors, especially the little kids. Very hands-on in a very gentle, positive, effective way. And I know he was under a lot of stress because we had to change locations almost on a daily basis, and it was very demanding. He had a certain budget and limited amount of time to get all that done, and he did it without. I never saw him lose his temper or seem stressed out, although I know how hard it was for him, and he treated everyone with respect every step of the way, and everyone wanted to do their best for him, and that's the ideal director who inspires good work and good collective feeling, in his
yeah.
team. So there's several movies I could say that about. Very different kinds of movies, different kinds of directors, men and women from different parts of the world. But the best experiences in terms of filmmaking are the ones where everyone feels involved. It's not just another job. Whether the movie turns out well or not, just the experience of doing it. That's all
Are
you've
there,
got.
I guess, are there certain stories that you love more than others that, like, for instance, if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I would like you to be in this," are there certain films where you're like, No, that's not interesting to me," but others where, like, what draws you to a character where you're like, "I would like to play that and I would like to explore that more, and that is going to help me grow in some way."
Well, I mean, it's a subjective thing when you read a script, but to me, good writing is good writing. If it's not well written, that's already a difficult thing, even if it's a good subject. Um, it's not a well structured script and the dialogue's not credible as human beings talking. Um, then it's already something I might not want to be involved with. At least the blueprint has to be good, whether the movie turns out well or not. Um, if there's just exploitative violence that has no purpose other than just people who like seeing that stuff getting off on it, it's not something I'm interested in, even if the story is halfway decent. So I've kind of avoided that stuff. Or, it's when you first start out, you're lucky to get any job on TV, on the stage. I
Hmm.
mean, you can always do something. You can, especially these days with iPhones, you can make a movie with your friends. You can write something. You could always put on a play, for your friends or something. But there's when you start out, you just want to get experience, and then the goal, at least for me, has always been try to tell stories that you're going to learn something from and that are saying something interesting, something that to you is actually seems thought-provoking and, not just a job for a job's sake. And I mean, I've been fortunate. I've had a long career and I've been able to make a living from being in lots of good stories. Some didn't turn out as well as I'd hoped they would, but the idea was good. I've also been offered things for a lot of money, more money than I could imagine making in one job. In some cases, more money than I'd made in all the other jobs I've done. But they weren't good stories, and it wasn't something, you know, that later on it's like, well, do I feel good about having done that? How much money do you need? If you can make a living and pay the rent and work and feel good about what you did, that to me is enough. But I have been lucky. I've been in some jobs where I was paid well. I've been in some jobs that did well, were popular with audiences, but you just never know. I think every person's different. I would never tell anybody else what to do, but I'm always looking for a story I'm going to learn something from,
Yeah.
and that you have to think about the fact when you play, especially if you're playing a role that has more than just one or two scenes, you're gonna be out there maybe for longer than it took to make the movie, promoting the movie in different places in the world sometimes. What do you have to talk about? If you read a script and you're offered a lot of money to do it, and you know it's not a very interesting story, what are you going to talk about?
Yeah.
When it comes time to promoting it. So I think about that too. It's like I want to feel good about at least about what we tried to do, the story we tried to tell, and that's sort of my guiding principle. I don't have a goal to work with this and that director or play this and that character.
Well, I was
All
gonna
right.
say you seem to see acting as an art. And I would think, though, that a lot of actors nowadays, it does seem more driven by, I don't know if it's, I don't want to, and I don't want to make a blanket statement about all actors, but it doesn't seem like story drives a lot of what most actors choose to do.
Well, it's what they choose to do and also what's available, I think that since the beginning of movies, really, most movies are not good movies from start to finish. It's hard to make a good movie that works. Some movies work. Half of the movie, you're like, wow, that's great, but they didn't know how to end it. Or there's some scenes that are just really bad. Or there's one or two actors that don't seem like it's good casting and they're not as good. To make a movie that everything hangs together from start to finish and is satisfyingly done, everything's put together well, it's really hard. I would say whether it was 60 years ago or now, any genre of movies, probably 95% of the movies aren't good. Maybe 5% you would say are good movies. Maybe it's even less than that. I don't know. I'm not to say that they can't be entertaining if they're not really good movies, but there's no such thing as a perfect movie, but a movie that I would say for me works from start to finish. There's relatively few. So you're lucky if you have a relatively long career, which I've had, I've been doing this for 40 years. I don't know how many, but if you have one or two movies that you can say that's a really good movie, that was well directed, everything worked in it, start to finish, very satisfying. I could watch it again now, etc. Um, if you have one or two of those in your resume in a long career, that's great. And I've been extremely lucky because I think I have more than one or two that I feel work. you know. But
Yeah,
again, it's subjective, it's personal. Other people might say, well, I don't think that's a good movie. Well,
yeah. Is there a movie you haven't been in that you think is really good, that you enjoy story-wise?
oh yeah, there's many from before I started acting and now. Sure, there are good movies. There's always a few good ones every year. And then there are many who get that movies that get hyped either through, the campaigns where people spend a lot of money and effort advertising but that's been so throughout the history of movies where you get kind of convinced to go see something and then to actually you get convinced that it's actually a great work of art and one of the best movies of the year or of the decade. And then a year later you see it again, you go, actually it wasn't that good. I don't know what the hype was. I mean, that happens a lot. But that's the business. I mean, it is a business and people have to cost a lot to make some of those movies and they have to get their money back. So they have to promote them and get you to believe sometimes that they're better than they are. I mean, that's the history of movie advertising, I suppose.
Can you name one that you like?
Many, too many. I wouldn't want to name one to leave out others, to be honest with
Yeah.
you.
Well, I wanted to ask you with the most recent one you made.
Mhm.
I haven't seen a film that it was when I say simple, I don't mean it in a mean term, but I mean it was a very simple story, a very human story about two people living life and interacting with like the natural world, interacting with each other. But it was
Mhm.
very deep human ideas, ideas of forgiveness and honor and love. Um, and to be honest with you, I mean, though that type of film wasn't a type of film that I would see in theaters or anything. Like it just didn't.
Or
That's
Western.
Well, no, it's not just a Western. It's the storyline itself was very layered and deep, and it seemed to be resonating on a human level, and that's just not the type of movies nowadays that get as much press, that you get
Mhm.
to see as much.
Right.
Like you said, you go to the movie, you see an entertaining movie, you're like, wow, that's good. But it's very different when you go to a movie and you're like, wow, that impacted me on like a human level, and I feel like I learned something. And when I saw your film, that's how I felt. But it's not a common thing I think you feel nowadays with movies. And I feel like with your film you were trying to tell something and explore human themes. And I
Mhm.
don't I think less and less movies are doing that. I don't know necessarily why, but just as a viewer experience, that's how I'm seeing it. And I wanted to ask, like, why did you want to make that movie? Why did you want to explore plots like that? And You know, I wanted to ask him, and maybe this is a little weird, but I kept wondering why the title was called The Dead Don't Hurt. And as I was watching the film, you had the bird, and where the little boy would say, does it hurt for the bird? And the dad said, well, no, the dead don't hurt. But the boy said, but it's still warm. And then later on, and I'm sorry for listeners if you haven't seen it, this maybe is giving away some scenes, so I'm sorry, but um, the the villain is not completely killed at the end, like you would expect him to be.
Mhm.
And I didn't know if, in a way, you were trying to say that the pain of life, the characters that died, like the wife and so forth, like their pain was over.
Mhm.
But interestingly, for the criminal, he didn't kill him at the end in a way to make his that he like his pain was worse in a sense because it didn't just end.
I
And
thought
I
about
I didn't know if that was something that you were trying to say, that, the deeper pain is not escaping it necessarily. Um, the pain of
yeah.
life. And so I don't know, was that maybe too wrong to think? I was I
No,
was
there's no
trying to think.
wrong. I mean, I what I like about it's often more important what you don't show and what you don't say in a movie story. I think that's the art of it. It's like how much you need to show to get a point across, how much needs to be said for you to have an idea about someone's past. Do you have to actually show scenes from their past always, or can you skip certain things and the audience and trust the audience's intelligence? I mean, I like it as a viewer, and I guess the two movies I've directed, written and directed, I wanted to make that kind of movie, a movie that I wanted to see. And I like movies where the first part of it, you're like, what's going on? I'm trying to figure it out. And then you start to get it. And there's something that happens or is shown that's interesting enough that I stay with it. And then as an audience member, I find myself in a way, because not everything is underlined with the music or the dialogue or some voiceover. I can think for myself. I feel like I'm involved and I participate in a sense in telling the story. And by the end of the movie, it's become my movie in a way. It's not the director's movie. And I feel I've done lots of Q&As, question and answer sessions with audiences all around the world for this movie. I did a lot of traveling with it over more than a year. And many, some of the comments were surprising. Um, Often people said things that were remarkable, like how they saw the movie, what they got from it, or from the title, or characters. And I love that. I like that every time you show the movie, it's a different movie in a way, depending on how you feel that day when you watch it and depending on who you're watching it with. And other people would see it, it's their movie. That's the way it should be. You make it, you hand it over. You can't really, I don't, you can, but there's no point in complaining about how someone sees something or disagreeing with them. It's like, well, that's the movie you saw. That's your movie.
Right.
Uh, and I find that interesting. As far as the title, I wrote the first version of the script, and I didn't know what the title was. And I thought, well, sometimes you find the title within the script you've written. So I reread it, and I came across a scene you mentioned where they're hunting for food on this long trip that the father and son are on. And there's this bird, and the boy says that, asks the question, does it hurt? This bird is dead, right? And he says, no, the dead don't hurt. You just throw away. And in that specific context, it means, no, it's dead. It doesn't feel any pain anymore. But taking that line, the dead don't hurt, which sounded to me like it sounds like a title of a Western in a way, which I liked. And this is a Western. And I like that out of context, it has more than one meaning. It also can mean the dead can't hurt you. The dead can't harm you.
Hmm.
Not just the dead don't feel pain. So it has at least a couple meanings, maybe more. And I like that aspect of it. and how you feel about the title at the end, without giving away what happens at the end and who you're thinking about. And yeah, so, but yeah, I like it when people have their own interpretation. They're going to have their own interpretation of any movie you make anyway, even if you try to explain everything, it's just a question of personal taste. I don't really, even if I can admire a musical score, I don't like it when the music is always telling you, oh, now you have to be afraid, or now you have to be happy, or now this is a glorious moment, or now this is a very sad moment. If you're already getting that information from the scene, why do you need the music to tell you the same thing? Often it's better if the music does something somewhat different. It's adding something else rather than just repeating what you're seeing. And then there's many scenes in this movie that there's no music at all, and
Yeah.
you don't need it. I mean, I composed and recorded more music than we actually used. Um, there's some pieces that I liked a lot, but in the end, by the end of the editing, it was like, do I really need it? Is it going to add something more apart from just being nice music? Or can it work without it? So any scene that can work without the music, especially in a movie like this, I feel like, well, take it out. You have to be tough on yourself. Just like the scenes themselves. There's a couple of scenes that are included in the DVD as extras that I cut out of the movie. That generally always happens. And especially if you wrote it and directed it, you have to be kind of hard about that, or cold. There's a saying, kill your darlings, in that process of editing. There's scenes that you love and you hang on to for a long time in the editing process. And in the end, you realize it's not moving the story forward, or this information has already been given. You don't have to repeat it, even though it's a nice scene, or even though, let's say, the performances are great in that scene, better than maybe any other scene. But do we need the scene for the story? If we don't, it's got to go. So,
Well,
yeah.
that was something else as I really appreciate is, there's some very violent moments in the film that are implied heavily but don't happen that you see, but then you see after, and you
Hmm.
feel like you did see it, but you didn't. And I found that very powerful and helpful in a way, because to be honest, some of the films I've seen in the past, what I remember most is the most scarring scene. I don't
Mhm.
really remember anything else. I just will remember that
Mhm.
one scene that stands out the most. Um, is that intentional on your part that when you're going through writing this or writing a script, you prefer to imply something? Because obviously there was violence. You didn't take just all violence out of the movie. But for some things that were very violent and could have been shown, and in several films would have been, you didn't. Was that
Mhm.
an intentional choice? Or,
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes partly it's respecting the audience and their ability to figure out what's going on, figure that out for themselves. But also, as I say, sometimes it's more important what you don't show. And there's one scene that I think you may be referring to, which is an attack on the lead character, the woman in the story, Vivienne. And yeah, you could have spent a couple of nights showing every detail of what happens, but I knew that in the scene after, morning after, when she's by herself, the aftermath, you could never show, no matter how many nights you filmed and how much you showed. There's you as an audience, what you imagine happened is much worse than what you could have shown. And also, if you show all of that, then what's the point of showing all that? Is it exploitative? Is it just to get people really upset? Is it necessary to tell the story? It's like you get what happened. You get what's happening and you get what happened afterwards. And what you imagine is more than enough. You don't have to have seen it. It's maybe even worse not having seen all of that. So it's just a question of discretion in storytelling. that works for that particular story. And there are other moments where you probably feel like you saw a lot more than you actually did. Let's say there's a scene in the saloon where a guy gets beat up really badly, but you don't really see as much as some directors might show you,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
you definitely get it. It's like, okay, I get it. And it's like audiences are not stupid. They can figure out for themselves and imagine also. It's not just violence, though. It's also information about characters. There's a scene where um, the lead character in our story is a mother who's by herself. She has a little boy, and she's in the saloon where she works, and and the daughter, the adolescent daughter of the piano player, um, she comes and picks up the boy and takes him home. That's something that happens regularly, even though we never see him at their home, right? And the lead character in our story, Vivienne, she's, French Canadian or whatever. She's grew up speaking French. And so even though she's North American, she's American. So she speaks with her kid in French. And then when the daughter of the piano player comes to take the boy away to spend the evening at their house while Vivienne works at the saloon, she says, "Au revoir, Vincent." Goodbye, Vincent, in French. And instead of answering her, bye, mom, or well, mama, he says, adios, mama. In Spanish, he says it.
Yeah.
Instantly, just with two words, adios, mama, you understand, okay, yeah, right. He goes to their house, and this is a regular occurrence, almost a daily occurrence during the week. And of course, he's learning Spanish there because it's a Spanish-speaking household. You don't even need to see those scenes. You understand a lot of things just with two words. So again, it's how much do you need to say and how much do you need to show to get across, a little subplot of some information about the relationship between the piano player and Vivienne, about the relationship between Vivienne and her son, and Vivienne and the daughter of the piano player and his family and so forth. So yeah, again, it's respecting the audience's ability to figure it out for themselves. If you give nothing, then they can't figure it out. But if you give just enough, then they'll participate in the story. They'll imagine what the house, maybe briefly, they might imagine what the house of Claudio is like and what is it like when this boy goes and has dinner there and they babysit him while his mom works. Don't have to show it always.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But another thing, Westerns typically, I think, and so I'll say as my opinion, often will show women as very either very sexual objects or very timid. I think especially in the older films of Westerns, like John Wayne and stuff, you had like very scared women, flighty kind of people. But one
Hmm.
thing I really appreciate about your film is that the main character is very much a woman. She cried, she felt emotions very deeply, she had the trauma of her past that would come up for her. But
Hmm.
also, there's a scene where your character comes home after the war and she asks you how your war was. And then you say, well, how was your war?
Hmm.
And I found that it was so cool to see a woman who didn't give up the feminine aspects of who she was, like she still was very female, but she was also strong and
Hmm.
she had her own struggles that she had to face while the man was away that were different. But she still had a lot of courage and she was brave. And I
Hmm.
really admired the fact that you kept both of those traits in a woman,
Hmm.
and that she didn't become one or the other. Just too masculine to the point where it's not believable anymore.
Right.
Or,
Just like a woman doing
yeah,
violent male things or something.
and
Right. Right.
having no heart. And it's just kind of like I can just kill all these people and I'm feeling fine. Um, And I wanted to ask you, like, was that also like, because that was so unique. Is that just something you did without really thinking about the nuances of that, or was that intentional that you wanted to show a female character who I think represented more of what women are like, more complex, but obviously still having some stereotypical feminine
Mm.
qualities, but very much having their own struggles that they have to war with that are just different than what a man would do.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the reason I wanted to make the movie, tell that story, tell Vivienne's story. I mean, even in the old classic westerns, and I wanted to make, and I think we did, make a movie that looks and feels like a classic, like a really one of the better, like the good classic westerns, from the 40s, 50s, um, 60s. But it has a woman as the main character. Um, Furthermore, it has a woman who, when the man decides to go off to war, and it ends up being a lot longer period than he thought it would be, and she thought it would be, certainly than he thought it would be. You don't see any of that. You stay with her the entire time. That never happens. I mean, that's something I wanted to see. Well, what's that like? Because, like an average, or let's say, I mean, she has extraordinary courage, I think, psychologically, even though she's not physically the strongest character in the movie. And it's not an exploitation movie where she's going to grab a gun and go shoot all the bad guys, and the audience is going to have that, brief, vicarious enjoyment, if that's what they
Yeah.
like. It's like, yeah, do it. Go kill all those guys. It's not that simple. It's more like real life. It's like, no, she can't overpower them physically, these guys. But psychologically, I think she's the strongest person in the story, stronger than her partner. Um,
Yeah.
goes to war, stronger psychologically than the bad guy or the bad guys. Um, and I'm, in thinking about the story as I was putting it together, writing it, so there must have been many, 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 maybe most, or thousands of women like her back then. Mid 19th century Western frontier. Life is hard and really hard for a woman, especially if she's on her own. There were probably so many women like that. It's just that back then, whether it was journalists or novelists or dime novels, whatever, anybody who was telling the story of the West, whether it was fictional or description of real events, historians, they were focusing on what men did: cattle drives, gunslingers, war, killing indigenous people, opening up the frontier, finding gold, discovering this and that, exploits of men. Very rarely, I mean, you can find letters and there's some firsthand accounts of women in the frontier, but they're rare, compared to all the material about men and what they did, what they were up to. But I'm sure there were many women like her, you know. And I was just curious. I thought, well, it'd be interesting, a story about a woman at that time. What did she do? And if her partner goes away, not only how did she survive, but how did she feel about it? And also
Yeah.
little girls, like you see her in her childhood when her father goes away to fight in a different war. Um, what is the effect on little girls and on women when their fathers, when their partners, when their sons, when their brothers, their husbands, whatever, when those men go off, not only what do they do to survive, but how do they feel about it? What's the effect on them, psychologically? So that was part of the reason that I wanted and that we wanted to tell the story, And we were very lucky that we got Vicky Creeps to play that role, because she has an inner strength. She's able to communicate a lot, even in silence. And she was great. She was perfect, Vivienne, really, I thought. But that was probably what we wanted to do. We wanted to tell a story about a woman who was a real woman with real feelings, real vulnerability, obstacles, regrets, and see how she got through difficult moments and how she reacted to the things that happened to her.
Yeah. But I also thought your character wasn't a stereotypical man. It's like we kind of have
Mhm.
stereotypes nowadays, which I think causes a lot of confusion for people because then there's a lot of you think you have to be a certain thing or do a certain thing to be, like for me, one thing I've always wrestled with is as I've grown up, is I have so many passions, but I also would like to be a mother. But I kind of have grown up in an environment where it's like you got to do one or the other. To be a
Mm,
woman, you got to pick. And if you're a career woman, then you'll be very successful, but you'll probably, you know, it won't be a very fulfilling life. It'll kind of be half-half. But then if
mm.
you're a mother, you just got to stay home and take care of your children and you're going to become sweaty and tired and you're not going to like anything anymore and it's just going to be terrible.
And you won't have the
And
time or the energy to do other
anything,
things.
right?
Right, right, right.
And then 50 years later, you'll be sitting in a rocking chair and you'll be like, what did I do? Um, but these stereotypes, anyway, that we make in film, but also just in life. But life is more complex, and I think there's such a beauty to the complexity, and that's just something I'm learning in life. It's like, what if there's just so more? Your life doesn't have to look like that to mean you're a woman, or to look like that to mean you're a man. You could still be a man or a woman, but you could do things that might seem manly or womanly or however you want to put it, but it's what if that's just what you like doing, but you happen to be that gender? And so I wanted to say, with your role as the character as the man is like he would read and he loved flowers and he liked to garden and he liked to sit outside and he was a soft-spoken person and kind of tender-hearted and more
Mm,
he wasn't easily angered. I didn't think anyway. Um
mm,
And if you're watching that, you're like, that's not really the man type. The man's like the big guy who like chops down stuff and is like shooting things and is very aggressive and the one who takes takes the lead. But he led and he did those things, but in his way that was different. And perhaps you
mm,
might think is more feminine, however you want to put it. And so
mm,
that was also very fascinating to me. And I really appreciated that because you didn't change the genders of the people, but you allowed them to be human.
mm.
And that just looked different for each of them.
Well, I mean, among other things, this is a love story. That's what this movie is, right? It's a story about a relationship between two people, and at the center of the story. In any relationship, back then or now or at any time, or friendship, man and a woman, between two men, between two women, between, any kind of, even a professional relationship. If only one of the two people or one of the people in the group is truly interested in what the others have to say and how they feel about things, the relationship's probably not going to last a long time. Um, in other words, the other person can say things you disagree with, or they can make what you think are mistakes, or they can have feelings that surprise you. But if you dismiss that, well, I don't agree with that. Then it's like you're not really a team, I guess. Any relationship that works, there's at least some interest from both parties, I think. If that relationship is fruitful and lasts, with its ups and downs and all that, of course, it only really works for an extended period if both people are at least somewhat interested in how the other person feels and thinks about things, and you do see that in the story. And sort of like living together, but allowing the other person to do the things they want to do and accepting that you're not always going to agree with what they want to do. And you can talk about it, but a certain amount of acceptance and forgiveness is crucial to any relationship that lasts. And I think you see that with these two characters. Um, and in the end, even though it's a story that at the beginning maybe it starts and you think, oh, this is going to be, I've seen this before. This is kind of a revenge story. This is going to be a Western revenge story. And even if the character sets out, the man sets out, and maybe that's what he thinks he's going to do, it becomes something else. In the end, forgiveness, a certain degree of acceptance, but certainly forgiveness, forgiving others and forgiving yourself also, for both the main characters, is more important than the idea of revenge or of having the last word or even violence itself. Forgiveness and acceptance are more important. And that's the story I think we tried to tell.
Do you th and feel free to say you don't want to answer this or not, but do you find that hard to do, to
In life,
forgive? And because, in films, you show it and you love that, right? You're like, that's great. I want to be able to do that.
right.
Um, but in your own life, and then when you face pains and sorrows like these characters in these movies, it feels harder somehow. Do you
Definitely.
find,
No, there's sometimes where I have a hard time forgiving, whether it's someone who's a friend or a family member or even a politician who lies and is cruel and vindictive. It's hard to forgive that. It's hard to like go, okay. Um,
I guess, how do you know you've done it?
Only you and your heart know if you may disagree. Only you know if you hate somebody or hate something, as opposed to just disagreeing with it and maybe trying to work against it or offer an alternative, working in a positive way. There's a difference between that. I can strongly disagree with you, and I can work hard to counter what you're saying and doing, or show, at least that in my opinion, what you're saying is false or damaging. You're hurting somebody, whatever. There's a difference between that, offering an opinion or trying to prove a case, and hatred, because hatred doesn't really take you anywhere. And I think most violence comes out of a hatred. And where does hate come from? It comes from an insecurity. I have no other tools to deal with this issue psychologically or physically other than violence and hatred. That speaks as much about my lack of tools, my lack of imagination. It speaks as much about that as it does about the differences of opinion you can have with any person or any idea. It is hard sometimes. I will admit there are certain things that I've seen happen or that have happened in my life where I'm like, I don't know if I can forget that. Or it's going to take me a while. I'm going to have to figure out how to, or maybe I don't forgive it and don't forget it, but I can do that and not actually hate that person. Because that person, like me, was a baby that was born and not without an intention of inflicting harm on others, but that's the way it's turned out. That's what they do. But they're still a human being, and hating them doesn't make them better and it doesn't make you better. So it's understandable to hate because of injustice, because of cruelty, because of racism, sexism, sexual or other physical violence. I mean, genocide, mm, perversion of democracy, um, lack of concern for poor people or people who are different than you, look different, have different ways of life. Um, Hating that doesn't make it go away, doesn't improve it. Trying to make a case against it or lead by example in a way that shows it up for being what it is, cruel and unfair, let's say.
Yeah.
That's a different thing. That's a different thing. But to really only you know if you have hatred in your heart for somebody or something or not.
But you do think it's possible for humans to be able to eventually forgive if they want to.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if you can forgive absolutely everything or not. Um, it's worth the effort.
Yeah.
But if you can forgive and forget, if you can find a way not to hate, that's, I think, a positive step.
Yeah. Well, is if you had to pick one thing that you would make the world better, what do you think you'd pick? Because I know, like you mentioned, I mean, there are a lot of things that the
Hmm.
world could
Well,
improve
I
on.
mean, eliminating deliberate cruelty, cruelty for its own sake, and that you can it can be cruelty toward animals, cruelty towards other people, cruelty towards the environment, nature,
And you're
cruelty toward
saying just because
toward yourself,
just
just
because you
cruel.
want to?
Pardon me?
You mean just because you want to kind of thing? There's no reason to it. When you say
Yeah.
cruelty for its
Well, you
sake.
can justify, well, they did this to me, or I was raised this way, or I want vengeance. If I get the power to do so, or I have the opportunity, I'm going to make my main goal in life to get retribution, to avenge. I think that is the impulse from that for that is hatred, and that's where cruelty comes from.
Yeah. Have you always felt that way?
Yeah. I'm not saying I don't make mistakes and sometimes I'm unfair to people or misjudge or misinterpret, or I've had moments where I haven't acknowledged someone as much as I should have, or all those things. But my sincere intention is not to hurt people deliberately, or otherwise. And if I've done so inadvertently and I realize it, I think it's always important to make that clear to the person. I'm sorry I did that, or I misjudged that moment, or I didn't appreciate what you were saying, or whatever. I think it's important to not be too proud.
Yeah.
Admitting mistakes or wondering out aloud to someone, did I hurt your feelings? Or you might not even realize it, but did I hurt your feelings by the way I responded to that question? Or did I bump into you in line? I didn't even mean to. Or did I butt in? I didn't even realize I did that, that kind of thing. If you don't realize it, then you're not conscious of it, then maybe someone has to say to you, hey, you realize you just did that. And you're like, oh, fuck. Okay, sorry. And then I think it's important to make amends, atone.
Well,
Atonement is,
I was gonna say, I mean, you sound very reflective because to be honest, I'm not quite sure I would like to reflect that much. Like, did I do that to that person? Did I um and doing this podcast, I've talked to people and several people have said they've made a discipline of reflecting because they think it's
yeah.
important. Um,
Mm.
do you find that something that you do where you intentionally turn off the distractions of the world and just sit and think or just meditate on life itself
Not
or
nearly enough. Not nearly enough. I mean, um, starting the last few days is the first time in, many like over a year that I haven't been like every day sort of doing too many things, too many plates spinning, and just trying to keep up and complete, uh, you know, commitments and traveling and doing things. Been busy in a way that's kept me from doing that. But there's always some moment you can steal. It's not ideal, but there are moments. Let's say you're on a bus, or you're in an airplane, or you're walking down the street because you have to go from point A to point B. What do you do in that time? Or you're sitting waiting for someone in a coffee shop. You can grab your phone and just be scrolling, looking, jumping around the internet until that person gets there, or you can actually look around and see who's there, who's sitting next to you. What's it look like outside the window? I don't know. I mean, I find more these days. Sorry. There we go. There's your phone. I'm going to turn it off. Sorry. I find more and more these days that, I mean, I don't have, like, I'm not on social media. Some people impersonate me and say they are. And I found out from other people they think they've been having conversations sometimes for months or more with me through, I don't know what, social media. People who have taken photos of me or things they might have read about me and impersonating me, which I think is a strange thing to do. I mean, life is short, man. Can you find other things to do to entertain yourself? But, you do see a lot of people walking down the street, or if they have just even 2 minutes to sit still on a park bench or waiting for somebody or waiting for a plane. It's like you got to be on the phone. You got to be, it's like, do you? Or one of the sadder things that you see sort of in modern day life, not just in big cities, but in towns too. You'll see two people out having dinner together and they're both on their phones while they're waiting for the food. They're not even looking at each other. Or people are in a beautiful place or walking down the street in the city and they're looking at their phone rather than, it's also a safety thing, bumping into people, getting run over by a car, or a bus. But I mean, just not being present, I think, which is what you're referring to. It's like be present, reflect on what's you're doing, what you've done recently, how you feel. What's today like compared to yesterday? This is the only today you're going to get. Tomorrow, today's gone, not coming back, other than in your always somewhat distorted memories of what today was. So it's like I do try to stop here and there when I can, but in recent days, my obligations have slowed down, and I'm trying to be careful about adding more commitments that will keep me from doing that. So I look forward to a period of regeneration, I think, physically, mentally, sleeping more.
do,
Mm.
do you rest by writing poetry and engaging in art?
Yeah, that's something that's helpful sometimes, writing stories, poetry. Sometimes it's going and seeing what someone else does, going to see a play or even a movie. Sometimes you can see that on TV or it's reading a book. I was going to ask you, you're something you're talking about earlier when you're talking about The Dead Don't Hurt, and you're saying, oh, there's not that many movies like that these days, or at least they're not, people don't seem to see them as much. And do you think that that's in part because people's attention span in terms of stories and layers of a story are being discrete and not showing everything, so that you have to sort of participate and really pay attention to it rather than, watching a movie on TV, but you're also scrolling your phone. You're not going to really get the movie that way, probably. Do you think that the lack of interest in or the lack of production of stories like that that are maybe a little, maybe more thoughtful or have a different kind of pace where you have to pay attention for an extended period of time. Do you think there's less of that and less interest in that because of the evolution of social media and people's lives, or do you think that has anything to do with it?
I think in part, but I also think mm, we don't like to think. Life is very hard, and for the majority of people, life is very painful. It's not
Mm,
that there aren't beautiful things of life, there is.
mm,
But when you get down to it and you have to think about your life, then you have to think about where you're going. And then you have to think about, well, what have I done in my life?
mhm,
And then sometimes you think about, well, what's going to happen when it's over? Am I going to go somewhere? Am I going to have I done enough things that I would be proud of myself when I think movies that cause us to think and be still and actually feel emotions strongly like sadness or anger or whatever it is, you're going to resonate. Those things will resonate with something in your own life.
yeah.
And so I agree with you. I think it's a distraction thing, but I think it's necessarily a distraction because I mean, I know I do it. I don't like to if I'm experiencing a lot of pain in a situation, it's hard for me to sit down and actually say, this is how I feel, and I would like to give space for myself to feel this way and to cry or to say this because it hurts too much. And it takes too much time, and then you have to kind of think through it, and you have to reflect, and you have to go through it again.
Mm,
So I would say I think it's both. I think it's hard because now there's so many choices and like you don't there's no one's out there going this is the right thing or this
mm,
isn't the right thing. It's like you got to figure it out for yourself and that's a lot of confusion and a lot of there's not a lot of direction there. And I think especially for people in my generation who are younger, I think it
mhm.
causes it to be more hopeless as opposed to something hopeful, you know.
Do you think part of that has to do with also, I mean, when I was, say, a teenager or even my early 20s, even though the news that you saw on television or heard on the radio was never, you can't be 100% perfect or complete, you were actually getting facts.
Yeah,
These are things that
it's true.
happened. These are things that happened. This radio show or that TV might have a different slant on it, what they feel about it, but these are the things that actually happened. These are the things that people said, and this is what this politician is claiming versus what actually happened. Um, Whereas now, and not just because of artificial intelligence, but just because quite a few politicians have learned in past, say, 20 years that you can get away with lying and really offensive behavior and insulting people, but especially lying, just not saying things that you know are not true, but doing that because it's expedient. You can get power that way, and you can keep power, and you can keep other people who might not do that as much or be as good at it or as shameless about it from having power. And so, what is really happening in California, Gaza, the Ukraine? What did the this or that politician really say yesterday or 6 years ago? What really happened? What really is happening? I'm thinking if I'm a teenager now, it's like, wow, why even vote? Why? I mean, it's all nonsense. Or this is the most fun message because it seems like the most rebellious and brazen, insulting. It's like, wow, this dude or she feels like she can say anything she wants. There are no rules. That's cool. And maybe some years from now, they may or may not realize, oh, actually, maybe that person wasn't that cool or rebellious. They was just simply lying. And
Yeah.
maybe they claim that they cared about me, but they don't really. They just want power. But in the moment, it seems very cool. It's like, wow, you can do that. You can lie your ass off and become powerful, or you can say that you're going to give someone insurance coverage and then just never pay them if something happens to them, health wise or accident or their house burns. You can
Yeah.
actually do that. Sure, you can, and you can get rich doing so. Wow, that's amazing. Or as a politician, I can get power by doing that. I could like not say one true thing during my whole campaign and win. Or I could say almost nothing that was true about my opponent and I can win. That's that's not the way it was. There were lots of secrets and lots of things that weren't said. And yes, there were conspiracy theories, always have been. It's human nature to some degree, but now such a jungle of lies and deliberate misrepresentations that I can see people becoming cynical or detached, um, not having the patience to listen to someone or have a discussion with someone that goes much further than devolving into insults and cliches.
Well, I
know?
I want to respect of your time, so I'll just let this be the last question. But when I saw in your movie at the end, the little boy asks you if the sea is the end of the world,
Mm.
and your character says, the end of this one. And so to kind of answer your question, do you think a lot of hopelessness and sadness, even especially for young people, is the fact that there just isn't morality and like what is right, and even the idea of a god is not something that is popular or um, something that people can like. There's no compass for people. There is no, you make your compass. And so I find that would be even harder and more confusing if you're young. So
Mm.
is there the lack of a belief in a God and in a right that you think might contribute to the fact that things are so confusing?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think there are certain people have a certain ideological point of view that yes, that's what's wrong with America. That's what's wrong with the world. People don't believe in God and certain moral codes. I do think taking religion out of it, um, there's a certain respect, common decency, common sense, treating people like you'd like to be treated. I mean, unless you're a masochist, you know, which I don't think people are extreme masochists necessarily, every moment of their lives. I don't think so. You want to be listened to, you want to be treated with a degree of respect. You don't want to be marginalized because of how you sound, how you look, how old or young you are, where you come from, whether you believe in a God or not. You just want to be treated equally.
So maybe the value of
And
life,
I think,
maybe.
well, when you talk in the movie, where you're talking about the scene where the boy says, "Is this?" Because he's never seen a vast ocean that seems to have nothing, there's no end to it. And he says, "Is this the end of the world, or is this like whatever the edge of the world? Is this the end of the world?" And the guy said, and the answer he gets is, "Well, this one." It's not necessarily implying that there is or isn't a life after this life. It just means that there are many kinds of lives, and each person's life is a story that has a different ending,
Yeah.
that has a different journey. This is just one moment in time. Um, we happen to be here together sharing it. That's that you can look at that as being good or meaningless or bad, depending on who you're with. But it is a fact. We are here now. I don't know what's going to happen next. And what happened before is no longer exists other than in memory. I was talking about a lot of those things. And in that particular context, there was a certain regret about the life that could have been, you know, with Vivienne, or the things that happened that were good, the things that weren't, how things might have been different. We all have thoughts like that. And the older we get, the more of those thoughts you had. If I'd only said this, if I'd only done this, or if my mother had reacted this way, or my father had not done this, or if I'd had the presence of mind to react differently in that relationship, in that moment, or in that job situation, or
Yeah.
that conversation, you know what I mean? There's an accumulation of regret also, I think, and that is can be disheartening and can beat you down. It can make you stronger, it can make you more understanding and compassionate, or it can make you shut down and not trust people and be angry. I understand that. There's days where I don't, you can get depressed about that. Um, and people do sometimes. And if you're young, which is what you're talking about, really, I think the disrespect for facts, the disrespect for people, those examples that we have from whether it's people who are our bosses at work, or certainly political leaders, uh, or influential journalists or bloggers or whatever, who don't treat people respectfully, who get something, money, attention, power, out of being disrespectful, deliberately disrespectful to people
Yeah.
or groups of people. Um, that sets a really bad example, and it can lead to you feeling maybe exhilarated for a moment if you feel like you're included in the ones who are, the ones who are favored against the ones who are not, or whatever. You're part of the people who are mocking others or something, or lying about others. That can make you maybe for a moment feel, yeah, I belong to something. I belong to a movement that does this. But in the end, I can't help but think that there's an emptiness to it, because it's not really about relating to people and learning about other people. You learn about yourself by learning as a child, even as a baby, but you learn by watching your parents and watching how do other people interact. What are examples of how do you speak to each other? How do you physically relate to each other?
Yeah.
How do you behave when there's a problem or stress? Do you get angry and break stuff and swear and insult people? Or do you try to work it out and figure out, okay, I'm having a bad moment here. Maybe I can ask for help, or maybe we can work this out together, or we are in strong disagreement here. Um, Maybe I don't have to punch you or call you names. Maybe it's like we can say, okay, well, I guess we're not going to agree on this.
Or
Maybe.
take a long swim, like in your movie.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to say, but yeah, I think that unfortunately there are a lot of examples from people who are leaders in our communities, in our nations, who are not leading by a sort of dignified example, or in a noble way, in any way, in a noble way, as far as forgiveness, the rule of law, common decency, respect, good manners. How do I want to be treated? That's out the window for a lot of people. That a lot of people who are influential, and that can't help but influence younger people, I think. So it's a serious
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, it is. But, I have to say I appreciate the fact that you're making films that help us think and think about ways that we could make life better for ourselves and for other people. And so I really do appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, there are experiences, exercises in trying to teach myself that too, because I sometimes lose faith or make mistakes, and then try to create stories that are seem like believable human beings who actually make mistakes, and then try to make up for that. Not a lot more you can do, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Vigo, thank you so much. And again, I
Thank you.
appreciate that you did this and in the midst of all your busy, and I do hope you get the rest that you deserve from all this.
Likewise. Thank you. It's been very nice talking with you, and good luck
Thank you so much. Have a good
and
day.
and Happy New Year. It's a little
Yes,
late,
Happy New
but
Year to you.
uh,
All right, bye.
thank you. Take care.